I'm Jean-Marie Guéhenno. I'm a professor at Columbia University, former Undersecretary for Peacekeeping, and now director of the Kent program at the School of International Public Affairs. And I want to say first that this panel is dedicated to the memory of Vartan Gregorian. It's been a tradition now at the Paris Peace Forum to honor his memory. Vartan Gregorian had a close connection with Afghanistan. He wrote a book more than 50 years ago on modern Afghanistan that remains a reference for anybody interested in Afghanistan. And so I'm pleased as a member also of the board of the Carnegie Corporation to honor his memory with this discussion. Now, this conversation we're going to have couldn't be more urgent when you think that, according, I think, to the latest figure, there are some 24 million Afghans in dire need of humanitarian aid, so essentially almost all the population. It's probably one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world. And it happens in a context of, the context we know of geopolitical fracture, where Afghanistan has often been the victim of geopolitical rivalries. And certainly today, we would all want those geopolitical rivalries to be put aside when it comes to humanitarian aid for the country. But it's not easy for a variety of reasons, and that's what we're going to discuss. We have only 45 minutes, so we all have to be very crisp. I will also ask you to speak close to the microphone. I've been told that if you don't speak close to the microphone, some people might not hear. And I will first give the floor to Syed Munadi, who was an Afghan diplomat, now working on Afghanistan and studying it and continuing to call attention to his country. Syed, you have been a diplomat in China. You have studied the regional environment, and I think we would all be interested to have your views on how the region and also China can play a role in supporting humanitarian aid. That's not been I mean, they have not been the main actors along the years, but at the same time, some of the countries don't have the handicaps of other countries when it comes to dealing with the new regime of the Taliban.
Thank you, Chair, for the introduction and the question. If we go back to the history of aid in Afghanistan, we would see that aid has been an important tool for formation, creation of a state and state relation and integration with the society. So aid has been an important tool. However, it should have been impartial or independent or depoliticized. So aid has been an important tool for politics inside Afghanistan, whether it is creation of states or it is relation between the state and society. For that reason, aid, unfortunately, especially when it goes to the aid, developmental aid has been used as an important tool to advance certain security and economic agenda inside Afghanistan, and mostly regional countries has been using that. So nowadays, we are hearing that some countries in the region providing some assistance and aid to Afghanistan, but most of them are really intended to support certain economic and security agenda. So for that reason, I would see region in Afghanistan as it is considered to be less integrated part of the world. The second one is also suffering from poverty and political challenges and disputes that we do have. So region not only has not been a functional source of support to Afghanistan, but also the assistance or developmental assistance have been some sort of supporting specific security and economic agenda. So I would say that China is among them. So China has been providing, I'm not just going to the figures, but these figures or this assistance mostly were for the security agenda of targeting ETIM, or another aspect, China looking to approach Imara, so Taliban, as an important entity or tool to cover Khilafah concept of looking beyond borders, especially ETIM, ISIS, and others, or Al-Qaeda, so they're looking for Khilafah. So region supporting or somehow providing assistance in order to achieve Taliban confidence to target Khilafah and terrorist groups that may target back to the region. So for that reason, humanitarian assistance was really politicized, supporting and assisting certain security and economic agenda inside Afghanistan.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I tell people to speak close to the microphone, and I don't turn on my microphone. So, no, thank you very much for what you said. And the fact that throughout the years, the international community has often had ulterior motives, so to speak, in its relationship with Afghanistan is a dimension we cannot ignore. At the end of the day, the operation in Afghanistan was launched first as a counter-terrorist operation. And the humanitarian, the development agenda came, I would say, afterwards as a second thought. And we have never fully recovered from that. I would want to turn now to Ilaha Omar. Her organization, Uplift Afghanistan, that she's going to introduce to us, is born in crisis to address crises. And if I can challenge you, I would say you focus on the local, but at the same time, we have to admit that the government of Afghanistan is the Taliban, and you cannot completely ignore it. So how do you manage to partner with the local while there is a government in charge that is not absent, that is there? How do you do it?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for keeping Afghanistan on the forefront of the global discussion. This is very important. I'm the executive director of Uplift Afghanistan Fund, and we were basically birthed in crisis mode, responding to the plethora of crises which unfolded after the fall of the Islamic Republic. We decided to, they say where there are challenges, there are opportunities, and take this opportunity to maybe look at aid differently. We did have a multitude of crises which we were trying to deal with, so we set up this fund. It's mostly Afghan-led, women-led, and the idea is to support grassroots organizations and community-led initiatives. We vet them, we help them with their proposals, we fund them, and we monitor and evaluate them with a team of data scientists to measure impact of aid. Aid has done a lot of good, but a lot of harm as well. So we really believe in giving equity and ownership to the organizations. We don't try to manage them. And to answer your question, this helps a lot with dealing with the de facto authorities. For example, the people on the ground, most Afghans know how to solve their problems. They've been dealing with challenges for over 4 decades. They need support, which we support, enable them with grants, and we really lean in on them. We listen to them. They know what's right. They know how to deal with the local authorities. Yes, we try not to deal with the Taliban, but you have to be realistic. They're in control, and but they know how to engage with them. They know how to ask for permission. There's this fine line that everyone's walking, and the people who know best are the people living in country, running these projects. Does that answer your question?
It does, but although one would want to see concrete examples how you
Sure,
how
actually,
it happens.
I can give you a beautiful concrete example. One of our partners, Community Driven Development Organization, are actually here from Afghanistan. Mokhtar just came about 6 months ago. He's the executive director of the organization, and he can give you firsthand experience on how they do deal and interact with the Taliban to make sure that aid is given and reached to the right beneficiaries.
Thank you, Rajan, and good morning, everyone. Really glad to be here. So, as you said, it's not actually possible in Afghanistan to ignore them. They are actually now the authorities that we have to deal with. The good thing about us, the way that we work and the way that our experience is that we are working with grassroots communities. We call them the Community Development Councils, the CDCs that has been developed since 2004, and different programs, National Solidarity Program, and then the Citizens Charter, National Priority Programs, that they have created over 36,000 community development councils in Afghanistan, and almost 95% of the country is covered by these CDCs. Of course, these CDCs, the Community Development Councils, has different capacities. We have worked with them in different stages since 2004. So what we do right now is we are working with these CDCs, targeting and making sure that we implement our projects in those areas that are mostly vulnerable, people are in need, and make sure that we leverage, the capacity of these CDCs, and we ignore to actually reinvent the whole wheel again, but use this leverage of people, the bottom-up approach, and work with these CDCs. Other thing that's really important, there is, of course, kind of, crisis with the Taliban, that they actually wanted to be, recognized by everyone, so that they have that crisis. So for that, we need to coordinate with them at different levels, and it's not been really easy for us. But what we do is we go to them, we explain that why we are here, we explain our intentions, that what we are doing and how we will do it, and we make sure that they know this throughout, starting from Kabul authorities to the governor, to the district governor, and we take them into confidence that this is how we want to do work. So this is only about communication and coordination with them. If we feel, as we do have such experience, that they are interfering, or they wanted to have, aid diversion or any other, elite capture kind of things, we ignore and we don't work in those places. Like we had a small example in Kandahar, we had such an experience. So we didn't move forward with our project, unfortunately for the people, for the CDCs that actually they really needed it, and we really had a good project there. But we didn't move, and we shifted our focus to other places that we could work in with our community.
Thank you very much for bringing that reality alive in this room. I will now turn to Matt Reed from the Aga Khan Foundation. I mean, the Aga Khan Foundation has a global reach, but it has been particularly active in Afghanistan, and I would say it has been with Afghanistan through thick and thin, really present all along, the dark years and the good years, and it is still they are very active, adjusting to the new situation, and I think it's important to have the perspective of an organization that has worked in Afghanistan for so many years, and to put it in the arc of to put your activity in the arc of history, so to speak. Matt.
Thanks very much. To come back to what Saeed was saying and talking about, Afghanistan as a place of ulterior motives, I think what distinguishes us is that our motives have always been all our cards are on the table. We've been completely open and transparent since we entered the country under the last Taliban regime, where we started working on humanitarian assistance and education, actually, right away. In the mid-90s, and then began building a development program. Our work has always been and will always be for the people of Afghanistan. We've been very clear about that with whatever authorities are in place. We are disciplined, how should I put it, decidedly neutral in a very disciplined manner. We've been very careful not to take sides in that sense and to always, again, work on behalf of communities. So we have a deep community roots. Our program now has grown. We're active in 22 provinces. We're working in 8 of those provinces directly. We're present in about 3,500 communities. We're serving 3.3 million people a year directly through our work. Always working with and through the community development councils and other community structures. It's absolutely vital to what we do. And so to come to the point about how to work with the new authorities, I mean, we should be clear that the new authorities were also either old authorities or shadow authorities for a very long time in many, many places of Afghanistan. So there are many organizations that have experience of how one can, in fact, negotiate and find accommodation and find ways to ensure that community needs are recognized and addressed. And so our experience in Afghanistan now builds on that base of community, strong community development. And I'd love to, I could go on and on, but I realize we're short of time. So the last thing I would say is that this community development structure that the international community invested in for 20 years is still active, it is still available. The people in those communities still have the kinds of local, let's call it authority and credibility that they need to negotiate their own accommodation with the new authorities. And I think what's very important now is that in humanitarian assistance, we find ways to support those structures and those people, because ultimately it's through enhancing their capacities and their kind of local authority, if you will, that we'll be able to work in this new environment, and that's what we're doing.
And may I ask you a question? I mean, you have been in Afghanistan for several decades now, and the Afghanistan of 2022 is not the Afghanistan of 2001. And how do you think one can take advantage of that? And how do you see the Taliban from 2022 compared to the Taliban of 2001?
That's a great question. I mean, I think well, there are a couple of things that are very important. I think that this whole there is a narrative, a facile narrative in the West that we accomplished nothing in Afghanistan and that it was all for nothing. That's simply not true. If you look at, first of all, you think about these community development platforms, the way that sort of local structures of authority and influence have been bolstered through some of these, call it subnational level governance structures is very, very important. Those are still there and active. If you look at, the kind of health results that we have today, I mean, maternal mortality has decreased, twofold, the same with infant mortality, et cetera. There's a lot to be done, but big difference. When you think about literacy rates, the fact that, over 50% of the country is now literate versus, say, 10, 15% 20 years ago is a huge difference. When you think about the number of young Afghans who've been in school and their exposure to the outside world. I mean, let's not forget, 20 years ago, there were no phone lines. So people in the provinces were very disconnected from Kabul, let alone the rest of the world. As you may be aware, I mean, our organization invested in Roshan Telecommunications, telecoms company, helped spark a vibrant telecoms industry. Now, if you go up to a remote village in Shugnan on the border with Tajikistan, you will find people with phones looking at YouTube. That still exists. And so I think that degree of connectivity is very important. I'll stop there.
No, thank you very much. And I think it's important that we have that in mind because, as you said, I mean, there's a tendency to think that we're just back to square one, which is not true. That being said, I'm going to turn to Barney Rubin. I think in a number of Western countries there is, of course, a sense of failure, and there is unquestionably a massive failure in what was tried in Afghanistan and didn't work. But sometimes that sense of failure can turn into sort of desire to punish, as if, because of the sense of guilt maybe of not having achieved what one claimed to was going to achieve. Now in the debate on Afghanistan, you you see that the attitude of the international community could make the lives of Afghans even more difficult than it already is. And Barney Rubin, is well known to all of you, I mean, he's a practitioner and a scholar. I mean, he's been a scholar of Afghanistan, I think, from most of your career. I mean, he knows Afghanistan better than many Afghans, I would say. But he's also been a practitioner working with the US government, with the late Richard Holbrooke, advising also working with the United Nations, with Lakhdar Brahimi. So very much aware of how you can turn knowledge into policy and how knowledge should influence policy, but does not always. And so today you watch the debate in Washington, you see the discussion. What do you think is happening and what do you think we should do?
Okay. Thanks to all of you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Jean-Marie. And I'm glad to be here with the other speakers. Though I see that Shukriya Barakzai apparently didn't make it, which is too bad. If I may, I would say, to talk about Afghanistan now, unlike the last 20 years, I wouldn't start in Washington. Because of course, President Biden recently said that Afghanistan is a God-forsaken country. Some people might say, unfortunately, there are quite a few people there who are trying to impose God on the entire country. But he said it was a God-forsaken country, and I think that encapsulates his view, which is that it was impossible to win militarily, it was impossible to have a peace settlement, and therefore the United States should just get out and do what it could about counterterrorism. I'm not going to say whether that's right or not. I think one thing that the last 20 years exposed is that the United States is not very competent at any of those things, despite the number of resources it has put into it. And the result today, on the whole, is that the countries that have most direct influence are the countries in the region. Now, that said, the Taliban actually want the United States to become more involved, and I think everyone in Afghanistan does, but it's not clear what they could do. The question for this session is about the relationship of humanitarian aid with a government that is unrecognized. And I'll just say, of course, there are many workarounds. I've been party to many of these workarounds because bear in mind that this is not the first time that the international community has faced this problem in Afghanistan. There was the government of Najibullah, which received no aid because he had committed a lot of human rights violations and had a very narrow political base. And of course, we know what the result was. Then there was the government of the Islamic State of Afghanistan, which has nothing to do with the Islamic State as it is known today, the one in Iraq and Syria, which similarly received no aid, except it's received some aid from some countries to fight against its enemies, but received no positive aid, development aid, or anything like that. And that was, it basically led to a situation of civil war. Then the Taliban did receive aid from a few countries, but relatively little, and that collapsed as well. So I'd like to make one point, which is, for humanitarian purposes, what Afghanistan needs most is a functioning state. Humanitarian action cannot be segregated from the rest of the economy and the state. Let me give you an example. Right now, humanitarian organizations in Afghanistan are facing very great difficulties because of the condition of the banking system. And the banking system has collapsed mainly because the Afghan central bank is under sanctions, and most of its resources, most of its assets are held in the United States. Now, there are now various workarounds that are being developed. 3.5 billion of the 7 billion have been set aside, and there's a governance body that is being set up, which is very controversial, seems to be approved of by neither the Taliban nor the anti-Taliban Afghans, but supposedly will enable the central bank to work. Second, of course, humanitarian actors need security. Sure, the main complaint of humanitarian actors over the past couple of decades was there were parts of the country to which they had no access because of security threats. In fact, there's a woman who is a chief-level advisor to, high-level advisor to Martin Griffiths, the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Assistance, a high-level advisor on Afghanistan. Her father was a medical doctor providing assistance in Afghanistan, and he was killed in an incident in Badakhshan. Security, of course, is a state function. Running the monetary system is a state function. Right now, they cannot bring, there's some negotiations underway to try to solve this problem, but the Afghan currency is printed in Poland, and they do not have the means to bring new banknotes into the country. And the banknotes they have are starting to fall apart. Unfortunately, it is not possible to put pressure on the Taliban without putting pressure on the people of Afghanistan. And bear in mind that Afghanistan is in a very desperate situation. These 25 million people that Jean-Marie mentioned who are in need, actually, there are 25 million people who are estimated to have an income lower than the Afghan poverty level, which I believe is $2 a day. Okay, I mean, Afghanistan is the poorest country in the world. That's not a widely known fact. It is the poorest country in the world. For many years, it was only the 4th or 5th poorest country in the world, but now it is the poorest country in the world. The illegal economy, which is very important, does not fully make up for that. Actually, I don't have a solution. All I can say is I see two scenarios. One is if we continue to give, humanitarian aid is necessary. It saved a lot of lives over the past year because they were predicting a famine and it did not occur. This year, there is a tremendous shortfall in the amount of aid that has been given, which is a function of the view in American and European capitals. So I don't know what will happen this winter. On the other hand, I don't have to repeat the problems with the Taliban government. There seems to be so far we do not have any way of influencing the Taliban government. The leader of the Taliban gave his son as a suicide bomber. So if he's willing to give up his son's life, I don't think we can influence him by refusing to have dialogue with the Taliban, or that dialogue will convince them to do anything that is against their principles, because their principle of organization is obedience to the leader. Now, in the longer run, of course, there are different political points of view. I can discuss that later if you want. But I just have to say that because of the near impossibility of divesting, of separating humanitarian aid from the need for security and the need for a functioning economy, Afghanistan has and the unwillingness of the international community, about which I can't make a judgment, to provide the assistance that would enable Afghanistan to develop a bit of an economy. Actually, the Taliban, as far as this negative type of security is concerned, the aid agencies are now able to go around the country without being attacked. I wouldn't call that security for the Afghan population, but it is security for aid agencies, but they can only do so much. So the available the realistic scenarios for Afghanistan at this point are all rather somber.
Yes, no, I think it's important that we have this reality check, but it does raise a fundamental question for the so-called international community. That is, we have heard around this table when the very smart things that are being done to get around the issue, but at the end of the day, you remind us that no country can work without a currency, no country can work without basic security. So it raises a hard question on whether the position of various countries in the West, because it's more the West there than China or Russia, that are taking this tough stance, whether that position should evolve and recognize, which creates a kind of ethical dilemma. But if we want the Afghan population to have a minimum, to be saved from the sort of dire circumstances it is in, does that mean that we have to come to terms with a government that you recognize we are not going to influence, but without which the country cannot function?
Let me add one thing, which is that, first of all, there was a lot of talk about China coming in and taking over from the United States. And in the immediate days after the collapse of the government, there were a lot of Chinese businessmen running around Afghanistan looking for opportunities. But they seem to have concluded that there aren't any, because I haven't found any significant projects or contracts that have been signed. Russia, now there's a case where the sanctions against Afghanistan and the sanctions against Russia have created a common interest in that the Russian government invited the Afghan Minister of Commerce, who, by the way, is a businessman from Panjshir, to come to Moscow, and they had long discussions there and also in Kabul, and they finally have signed an agreement, a trade agreement, which will supply Afghanistan with basically the same things that the Soviet Union was supplying it with in the 1980s, namely fuel, energy, and food grains. Now, I know one of the Russian diplomats in the embassy in Moscow, and I said, so how are they going to pay for it in Kabul? And he said they have a budget for it, which means I have no idea how they're going to pay for it. So again, it may be another agreement that is not really implemented, but you know, they do need food grains and they do need energy supplies, and they don't have money. So, and those are not, food grains can come with humanitarian aid, energy supplies cannot.
Almost 10 minutes left for a discussion, and I see that you would like to intervene, Syed?
Yeah,
please.
just one thing that I would like to intervene. If we like it or if we don't like it, aid has been an important tool in Afghanistan, state building and state integration with the society. So that's one of the important tools that we can bring change to Afghanistan. So in my understanding, a solution that can function is we have to have an humanitarian aid diplomacy, a diplomacy which helping to support or push Taliban in order to observe human rights, to create inclusive government, because without that, we're not having any other tool. So that's really important. And at the same time, maybe this conditioning aid would provide some difficulties that we target or we help people. So I think if foundation or if we provide assistance to be far from Taliban, I think that is really important. We're creating an online platform or maybe personal remittance that aid can be provided to people, or foundation that they can provide aid to people without Taliban involvement. So in my understanding, the only the possible tool that currently and can be functional to Afghanistan is aid. And history of Afghanistan has shown from mid-18th century shown that aid is the only functional tool that can be used. That's it. Thank you.
I see several hands. I would like each of you to introduce yourself, so please.
Good morning. I'm Laurent Gillois. I'm the Deputy Director of the UN Women Brussels office, so representation to the EU institution. Thank you so much for your respective contributions. I think this is really an important discussion to have today. UN Women has a presence in Afghanistan and that has stayed throughout the crisis. As you mentioned, actually, of course, Afghanistan is facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world today. And at the same time, as you know, and have mentioned also, women and girls are today systematically excluded from public life. And we have seen that their basic human rights are and human rights to education, access to employment, even freedom of movement has been reduced over the months. So it has been a year of decreasing disrespect for women's human rights. And I would like very much actually to build on what you were saying about community participation and also what you were just mentioning about aid and link it up to a very interesting discussion that we've been having here at the Paris Peace Forum on feminist foreign policy, development policy, and really ask your contributions as to how we can actually constructively address this question of how can we implement a gender-responsive development policy, feminist foreign policy in the context of Afghanistan today. And perhaps building on what you were just mentioning about community participation, or also picking up your brain on just the last point that you were making. Thank you very much.
You want to answer?
I'd like to give another example of how we're doing that. We're reaching women, a lot of women, entrepreneurs, maybe I would call them somewhat underground, have been submitting proposals to fund their projects. So we've issued microfinance grants and we're supporting women-led initiatives. So we're a small-scale organization. But recently, we launched a pilot program, thanks to the funding from OSF, to the financial inclusion of women, digital payments, straight and directly to women beneficiaries. We did this through the help of our local partner who identified the beneficiaries and helped train the women and upload the apps. And it was quite a successful project. We're still in it, but there are ways to reach women, and we are clearly doing that.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I would say a couple of things. One is I think that the approach, building on what Barney had said around the conditionality of aid, I think the approach of trying to set red lines has, especially around things like girls' education, and to some degree women's participation, has actually undermined the ability of many women in Afghanistan to find their own spaces and find accommodations. The fact is that we know in the country, around the country, there are great degrees of variation in terms of the kinds of restrictions that there are on women, regardless of what the official line has been. That doesn't, I don't mean to say that to underestimate the restrictions and the depth of the problem, but I would say that there's huge variation. And if you want to have, I think, a feminist or gender-responsive foreign policy, it would be trying to understand where women do have space and helping them use that space. And I think the problem is that we've taken too much of a principled line, if you will, in policy, and not a pragmatic enough line in setting those policies, because there ought to be ways to help women where they are in their communities live their lives. And as an international community, we haven't, currently anyway, we haven't been designing the instruments well enough to allow us to do that. And I would encourage us to focus much more on that. So again, focusing on that community level, focusing on where progress can be made, focusing on those places where there is a bit of an open door. Because taking a kind of, winner-takes-all approach is going to lead nowhere, and has led nowhere. I mean, we know after, more than a year of this, it's gotten us absolutely nowhere. In fact, it's closed space.
Last question. I mean, I see so many. Maybe can we extend a few minutes? Maybe so. Let's collect the various comments and questions. So you were the first, and then we go around the tables.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Juan Garrigues from the Dialogue Advisory Group. As has been said, before the Taliban took over, they were already controlling a big chunk of Afghanistan for quite a few years. And NGOs have been negotiating humanitarian access for many years, even signing memorandums of understanding. And in that time, kind of connected to what Matt was saying, my understanding is there was quite a bit of strategic autonomy in the way that the Taliban operated. And locally, they had quite a bit of space to adjust to the local realities in the arrangements that they would reach on different issues. My question is, how much has that changed, or has it not changed? Mukhtar, you mentioned an example in Kandahar, but is it much more centralized now, or are the Taliban authorities still have quite a lot of space locally to still reach those arrangements, depending on the local realities? Thank you.
Yeah, hi, good morning. My name is Lucia De Luca, and I'm here also representing the Afghan Women Coalition for Change, which is a recent organization founded a year ago. And, the other people were supposed to be here, but for reasons that maybe many of us can understand, they are not. What I wanted to say is that among the various actors which have been mentioned this morning, maybe we should also consider like Afghans in exiles, because indeed this Afghan Women Coalition for Change has been funded by Afghan women parliamentarians who are in exile in the UK and other parts of the world. So there is also from their side a very united vision about how to contribute to the rebuild of Afghanistan. Humanitarian aid and conditional aid, it's one of the elements, and dialogue also with the Taliban. It's actually something which they would like to pursue. Just sharing this with you today.
I'm Rasul Rasuli. I'm social development governance expert with Uplift Afghanistan, also with CDDO. And I've led two community-driven development programs, the National Solidarity Program and the Citizens Short-Term National Priority Program in Afghanistan. So just 2 points. One, in terms of women participation in the communities. As of now, as Matt may also confirm, we have 43% active participation of women in the CDCs still, which is a window of opportunity to reach out to community women. And one of the World Bank funded projects, Community Resilience and Livelihood Program, is going to be also implemented through the CDCs via the UNOPS. And one of the conditions for operationalization of this project is active participation of women. So that's good news, and we look forward to the implementation of such projects. And second point, I think for the sake of sustainability, I think we need to think of moving or phasing out from only humanitarian aid or support to Afghanistan slowly towards more sustainable service delivery and development, which is something inevitable, and the people cannot depend on the humanitarian aid in the middle of the global economic crisis. Thank you.
Test.
Thank you.
Test.
Yes.
C'est bon, oui. Thank you so much. My name is Pashtun Jirak and I'm from South Afghanistan and I'm the former student of SANSPO. I have a question that the recent United Nations report shows that 80% of supplies of narcotics and drugs are from Afghanistan, and 33% of the drugs has been increased in the cultivation in Afghanistan. As well as we have the poverty ratio, according to the United Nations report, that 90% plus Afghans are under poverty line till the end of this year. Women and girls are not allowed to go to school and get education and do their jobs. They are at their home. Civil societies are blocked. Isn't this a warning sign for the world? Because Mr. Rubin said that this is the third time the international community is leaving alone Afghanistan in the time of Daud Khan, at the time of President Najib, and finally at the time of Dr. Ghani. Do you expect in the future, won't we have security threats to international security? Will Afghanistan and Afghans and their culture and their history will be responsible for this? Or at least we will have someone responsible, like in Doha peace agreement, which used the title of peace, and until we don't have peace in Afghanistan, we don't have stability in Afghanistan. This was just a peace agreement and political transaction with Taliban, and we lost totally our democratic and republic government in Afghanistan, and still the international community are asking for the help from Taliban. They are extremists. You know that since 1 year, we have 555 new religious madrasa in Afghanistan, which they are pushing the new generation to extremism. How we expect from Taliban, from the human rights and the social rights and women rights? How we expect from the Taliban? Why we are asking from the Taliban? Even we hand over, the international community hand over Afghanistan, the 20 years of the outcomes to Taliban. Thank you.
To close, because otherwise we already 5 minutes over time, so maybe you are the last, and then, oops, let's see. That's a signal, I guess.
It's a clear signal, but if you can give me 20 seconds. I just wanted to say, because first of all, I think what's very important is to be really careful about not politicizing aid here while people are starving to death, and these topics being abused over if aid should be given conditionalized. So I think it's a very fine line here, and it's very dangerous. What I think really is important in the donor discussion, and I'm missing this very much, is if that even should be an option to channel aid to the current authorities. I think donors really have to take into account the internal revenues the authorities have access to since many years. There's very clear numbers. It's been in the billions per year from the drug trade, of course, and other illicit incomes in the past, and now it's of course exploded, and it's a very high number. So I think that always has to be taken into account. They can also be asked to deliver services to their own people if they were up to any good. So this is something I wanted to add. Thank you.
We had comments and we had a couple of questions. And I know, Barney, you wanted to react to the previous round. We had a specific question on decentralization, on the variations among Taliban. So maybe, Matt, you could address that, and Barney, I don't know what you wanted to address, but over to you.
First, what Taliban had is not decentralization, it was operational disorganization. And as they become more organized, they will become more centralized. I just want to say about the international scene, there is a kind of consensus now in that not a single country has recognized the Taliban, and not a single country is conducting a proxy war against them. So that means there should be an excellent opportunity to try to stabilize the country, but there isn't, because the international community is now incapable of cooperation because of relationships among the United States, Russia, Iran, and China. Second, I just want to point out there was an inconsistency in two things our Afghan colleagues said, and they're both right, but they're inconsistent. Which is, one is what Afghanistan actually needs is development assistance or to revive its economy, and the other was that we should not give development assistance to the Taliban. So that, in short, is the problem.
Do you have anything to add, or should we close?
I think Barney covered it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry I couldn't give the floor to everybody, but what's important is that Afghanistan doesn't disappear from the international discussion, and that we keep mobilized on Afghanistan, and we keep also a nuanced and sophisticated view of what can be done and what cannot be done. So thank you all.